Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I am your host. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com. As you know, this podcast is listener supported, so if it is something you value and you'd like to enjoy some perks, please head over to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You could also just find the link at joyfulvegan.com. If you are a listener on Apple Podcasts, you can also become a subscriber there for bonus episodes. Thank you so much in advance for supporting this podcast, for subscribing to it. I guess they're calling it following now, not subscribing. And thanks for listening. And of course, if you haven't left a rating and review, please consider doing so. It really helps inspire others to become listeners. Today's episode is everything you ever wanted to know about herbs and spices but didn't know to ask. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing fabulously well. Thanks to everyone who joined me for my online workshop on avoiding burnout, preventing what we call empathic distress, not compassion fatigue, and learning how to cultivate resilience and hope. The materials, which includes 3 hours of video presentations, Q&As, and reading materials, will be available for a short time at joyfulvegan.com. If you miss out, I do plan on hosting it again in the future, but for now, head over to joyfulvegan.com and grab yourself those materials. The next workshop I will be announcing soon will be on being an effective advocate. So stay tuned and make sure you're on the mailing list at joyfulvegan.com. Also, I just rolled out a new recipe bundle for Easter. There are 11 recipes. As you may or may not know, over at joyfulvegan.com, you can find what I'm calling recipe bundles, essentially ebooks. And these ebooks, these recipe bundles, have been focused on different holidays. So we have Thanksgiving, we have now Easter, we have Passover, we have Christmas, and we have Hanukkah. And I'll be adding more. And then, of course, there are dozens and dozens of on-demand classes that have video demonstrations by me and recipes. One more announcement. We are officially confirmed for Rwanda, November 2024. So if you were waiting to book your spot to join me in Rwanda to see the mountain gorillas, if you were waiting for the trip to be confirmed, the trip is now officially confirmed, which means it is 100% a go, as is Northern Italy in June. So they both have spots. They're both confirmed trips. They both have spots on them, but don't miss out because obviously it's a limited number. So go over to joyfulvegan.com. You can click on vegan trips and learn more. Now on to our topic. Everything you ever wanted to know about herbs and spices. And by the way, I do have an on-demand class on herbs and spices, some of what we're going to be talking about today, but the packet also includes recipes. And then there's another packet on-demand class called Cooking with Global Herbs and Spices. So it is a topic that gets me very excited. I really love talking about herbs and spices because I think they're really misunderstood. I think they're really underused. I'll say, especially in American cuisine. I do think that people have lots of herbs and spices in their kitchen, or they get those cute little herb and spice stands for jars, and they're cute and they're adorable. And then they just sit on the shelves and go stale. And then people blame herbs and spices for going stale instead of staying fresh for 5 years, because most people have had spices sitting on their shelves for over 5 years. And so I really want to encourage you by the end of this episode to feel confident about cooking with herbs and spices. We're going to be talking about dried herbs, fresh herbs, whole spices, ground spices, and just so much. So first of all, let's establish what the difference is between an herb and a spice. How would you define it? Can you, in your head right now, are you defining the difference between an herb and a spice? So an herb is a whole or part of a plant that's used to flavor food, right? And so this usually comes from the leaves of plants, can also be softer stems, but mostly leaves. They can be whole, they can be ground, they can be fresh, they can be dried. So you've got your basil, bay leaves, chives, cilantro, also called coriander. You've got dill, one of my favorite herbs, lavender, marjoram, oregano, parsley, rosemary, sage, savory, tarragon, thyme. Those are examples of herbs. A spice, on the other hand, is used to flavor food, but it's derived not from the leaves of a plant, but from the seed, the bark, or the root. And it's normally ground and powdered, although in some cases you might have whole seeds. And we'll talk about that. So when we talk about spices, we're talking about cardamom, cayenne pepper, chili flakes, cinnamon, cloves, coriander. In this case, the seeds are called coriander, whereas the leaf is called cilantro, although in some languages and cultures, they will say coriander to refer to the leaf itself as well. In the United States, in American English, we say coriander to refer to the seeds, and we say cilantro to refer to the leaves. Not that any of that matters to me because I cannot stand cilantro, although I do like the seeds. I like coriander, so it just goes to show the difference in flavor between leaves and, in this case, seeds. Moving on, we've got cumin, got curry powder, which is usually a blend of different spices, fennel seeds, garlic powder, ground ginger, which is different than fresh. We're going to talk about that. Yeah, mustard powder, nutmeg, paprika, sesame seeds, obviously, and turmeric. So we're going to talk about a lot of these different spices. Now, a question I'm asked a lot, first off, is how long do they last? So I was teasing that most people have herbs and spices on their shelves for 5 years. That's probably average, to be honest. What that means at that point is those herbs and spices are stale. They're not toxic. They're not going to kill you if you eat them, but they have most likely lost their flavor and their freshness after 5 years. So when we're talking about the dried ground spices, if they are stored properly, they can last. I usually kind of use 1 to 2 years as a gauge for dried spices. When we're talking about dried herbs, however, that time is less. So I usually think about 6 months to a year. Now you can store them properly and they're going to last a little longer. And that means just making sure they're not stored near moisture or heat or bright light. So kind of what you'd expect, what you're hopefully doing already. Now, I buy my spices from a couple different purveyors. Some of my spices are from the bulk section of my bulk store, and I love just filling them up into the jars I already have or containers, and then I bring them back home and I fill them up in their jars. So it is important to know what the label says in terms of the expiration date, if you will, because there is a shelf life. And if you don't know how long they've been sitting on the shelf at the store, then how are you supposed to know how long they'll last in your kitchen, right? So take a look, because it's true that they could be sitting on the supermarket shelves for months and months before they even come to you. So take a look at the label and see what the date says. And also when they're home and you're not sure if the spices are past their prime, the date's not going to really help you. What's really going to help you are your senses. So look at the spices. Has the color faded? Are there signs of insects? Is there mold? Smell the spices. Has it lost its aroma? Is it pungent? Is it still strong? Can you still smell it when you open the cap? Taste the spices. They're not going to harm you. They're just not going to be super flavorful if indeed they are stale. So that's what you're gauging. Have they lost their flavor? If they're still flavorful, they're probably still good. And like I said, just check the manufacturing date. If you buy spices in bulk like I do, the bin should also have a manufacturing date, or at least the store managers should be able to tell you. But the more you become familiar with these spices, the more you're going to use them. And one of the ways to really become familiar with the spices and the herbs, personally, I don't label the jars. Now, I know that sounds crazy and you think that's ridiculous. What if I put cumin in and I'm supposed to put cinnamon in my apple pie? Or what if I put cinnamon in and I thought it was chili powder and it ruins my chili? Okay. That is how your senses will come into play. So that's how you're going to get to know the spices. Now you can maybe use a little glass marker, a marker that's used for glass. We use it all the time when we have parties so that people can keep their glasses, not their spectacles, but their glass, and they can keep it through the night without, forgetting where they put their glass and needing a new one. So there's these really cool markers that you can write on glass with, and they wipe off when you do the dishes. So use maybe a glass jar like that if you have your glass spice jars. And then if you want to put a little hint on the bottom of what it is, then do that. That's fine, especially as you're learning. I also store my spices and herbs alphabetically on I have a spice rack, but I also have a spice drawer because I have a lot of spices and herbs. So I have them alphabetical, number one. So that does help. And hopefully, as you start to do this, you will be able to discern the difference between cinnamon and chili powder just by looking at them. And of course, by smelling them, you're going to know the difference. But that is a hint in terms of getting to know your herbs and spices, is actually not putting a label on them. Next question I get often is, should I buy whole spices and grind them myself, or should I buy spices already ground? So that's when you find them in the powder form. So listen, you're going to hear me talk a lot about flavor and freshness, and that's something to consider. If you want the freshest possible anything, you want to get them whole and then grind them yourself. You are going to get a lot of bang for your buck. Whole spices tend to also last longer. They have a longer shelf life than the ground spices. And the main reason for that is because the spices themselves have essential oils. And these essential oils contribute to the flavor and the aroma of the spices. And those essential oils are protected by the outer shell or the skin of the whole spice. So when spices are ground, their surface area increases, exposing more of the spice to air and light, and that leads to a quicker loss of flavor and aroma. So some considerations. If you don't want to buy all of your spices as whole spices, I totally get that. Consider this. Cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, whole peppercorns, they can retain their flavor and aroma for an extended period of time, several years if they're properly stored. So I usually get cinnamon sticks. I also have ground cinnamon, but I also get cinnamon sticks. I have whole cloves. I also have ground cloves, and same with peppercorns because we have a pepper grinder. So we do get peppercorns, and they can last for a really long time. The ground spices I mentioned earlier, 1 year to 2 years, but that's pretty different than the whole spices that can last for several years. So one thing you can do is get a grinder or a coffee grinder. You can get a spice grinder or a coffee grinder. I have a coffee grinder, and I know many of you know that I've never had a cup of coffee in my life. And so our household has changed a little bit because now there are coffee paraphernalia things in our kitchen because David has now been grinding his own coffee beans and making coffee, which is just bizarre. He's still a tea drinker, but he is exploring this world, and it's just blowing my mind. But I still have my little single blade spice grinder, coffee grinder, whatever you want to call it. And I use this for the small spices, the ones that I get whole. Now, one thing to keep in mind is because I mentioned those oils can stick to the grinders. So get an inexpensive one. I'm just talking about kind of, like I said, a single blade coffee grinder / spice grinder, and use them only for the spices because they will eventually, like, clean it well, obviously, but those oils will eventually get in the grinder, and you don't want it to smell like cinnamon when you're trying to make something more savory, and vice versa. And then finally, the last thing I'd say about seeds, some of the other seeds that I do get whole are things like cumin seeds and coriander seeds. Some dishes, especially Indian dishes, really benefit from starting off with frying up some of the whole spices, like the whole cumin seeds, which are absolutely fragrant and flavorful and have a texture, and that's going to be added to your dish, whatever you're making. So, follow the recipe, check it out. And it doesn't mean you have to grind every one of your spices, but some of them would be required to stay whole when you're cooking them and when it calls for in a recipe. So just be mindful of that. Now, one thing I want to maybe should have started with is people ask me all the time, like if I had to name like 10 essential herbs and spices for the kitchen, what would they be? This is obviously very personal. I've already mentioned that I hate cilantro, so you're never going to find that in my house. And luckily, David, he likes it, but he doesn't love it so much that he laments that we don't have fresh coriander or fresh cilantro in the house. So it is very personal and subjective, but I will tell you my answer and 10 is really hard. I mean, 10 is just super hard, but I'll tell you. So I always have bay leaves, and one of my favorite places to get herbs and spices from is a company I've talked about before called Burlap and Barrel, and they specialize in single origin spices so that they know the grower, they know exactly who those spices are coming from, who they buy them from before they then pass them on to the consumer. And so they had ground bay, and I thought, oh, that's perfect because I make stock a lot. And the bay leaves I would find would just, I just didn't find they kept their pungency as long as I wanted them to. So I got the ground bay leaves, and it's been fantastic. And so I make vegetable stock a couple times a week because I have so many vegetable scraps, and I love the bay leaves. Ground bay, you can get whole bay leaves. I love that. So I do use bay a lot. And if you want to add instant flavor to any stock or any broth or any soup, bay leaves are fantastic for that. Obviously, cinnamon. What is a house without cinnamon? Cumin, kind of the same thing. Cumin is used in so many different cuisines. Indian cuisine, different African cuisines, just so many Asian cuisines. So it's a really versatile spice. Highly recommend having cumin. Fennel seeds. I love fennel seeds so much. They are wonderful for baking. They're also wonderful for cooking. And again, kind of in more Asian, Indian cuisines. And you can also have anise if you like fennel seeds. Anise seeds are really good to have as well. Especially use fennel seeds and anise seeds around the holidays, the winter holidays. Nutmeg, kind of the same thing I said about cinnamon. And of course, we've got then our fresh herbs like oregano, tarragon, thyme, and turmeric, although that's a spice, not an herb. So turmeric as well. Now, this is also just assuming that salt and pepper and chili flakes and chili powders are their own separate category, because I always make sure I obviously always have salt. I always have pepper. We do use salt flakes. The Maldon salt flakes are fantastic. Peppercorns, because we have pepper mills. So do I have ground pepper? I don't even think I have ground pepper in the house. They're just peppercorns, and we just use the mills. And then chili. We have a variety of different chilies. I mean, that's its own. So you could ask me what 10 different chilies I would have in the house, and that would be a different answer than what are the 10 different herbs and spices I would have. So those are my answers. I also want to just add coriander to that as well, because I mentioned earlier, I do love coriander. I just don't like cilantro. Now, I rarely use dried parsley. You notice that I didn't say parsley, and I didn't say basil, and I didn't say dill. So when we're talking about dried herbs and spices, and that's what we're talking about, I just find that I don't get a lot when I'm cooking with dried basil, dried dill, and dried parsley. I would rather use the fresh versions. Now, it's not that I never do use them, but I just don't find you get as much flavor, and I don't get a lot of bang for my buck. So when it comes to basil and dill and parsley, and in cilantro in your case, because I'm assuming you like cilantro, then yes, the fresh versions are going to be better. Tarragon, I don't get fresh very often. I do use dried tarragon. I do use dried thyme, even though I use fresh thyme as well. And same thing with oregano. I will get fresh oregano. It adds so much flavor. But dried oregano has a lot of flavor, and so does dried thyme, and so does dried tarragon. I just don't find that's the case with parsley or basil or dill. And as for fresh herbs, of course, it's so hard to talk about fresh herbs because they don't sit in my kitchen, right? I use them quickly and I freeze them, and we will talk about how to freeze them. There are so many ways to use fresh herbs. I do think that something that also happens with folks is they're following a recipe that calls for some fresh herbs. So they'll buy a bunch of basil, for instance. They use some of the leaves for the recipe, and then they have a bunch left over and they don't know what to do with them. So they tend to throw them out, and they obviously don't last very long. So My advice to you when it comes to fresh herbs is use them any and every way you can. So do not skip fresh herbs when making a green salad. Absolutely. My favorite salads are salads that have fresh basil, fresh parsley, fresh chives. You can put fresh cilantro in. So add them to a green salad. They add so much flavor. Same thing, like it adds flavor and color when you sprinkle them over finished dishes. So I don't know, if you bake a potato, sprinkle just some chopped fresh herbs, parsley or chives over your baked potato. So it's going to add color, it's going to add flavor, and it's going to add nutrients. And we're going to also talk about all of the nutrients in all of these fresh herbs and spices. And that goes with just add fresh herbs on soups, salads, entrees, whatever it is. One thing you can also do is if you're making a grilled cheese sandwich, add some fresh basil on top of the cheese before you make it in your pan. You can add obviously fresh herbs into soups and stews just before serving them. So parsley, dill. Oh, make a potato soup and just throw in a bunch of dill at the end. Chives again work so well. One thing I do a lot in this house is I infuse water. So I add mint, rosemary. We have a ton of rosemary all over our property. So I add fresh rosemary, basil. If you have herbs that you're not using and you don't know what to do with them, infuse them in some water. I will say just be mindful of the ones that tend to be a bit woodier, like rosemary, for instance, because I find that if I oversteep the rosemary, and the mint too, and the basil, I think it can happen with even the softer stemmed herbs, is I find that there's a bit of, how shall I say this, earthiness, that it's almost like they become a bit dirty. So I would say if you're going to make water infusions with fresh herbs, just infuse them for half hour, and then taste the water, see if you like it, and keep infusing if you need to. But eventually you're going to want to take those fresh herbs out because I feel like it can get overdone, oversteeped, if you will. So let's talk about some of those health benefits. They are packed with health benefits, they being all of them, herbs and spices. I talk about this at length in my book, The Color Me Vegan, because in the book that I break up according to color and therefore phytochemicals, which is what makes plants colorful, phyto meaning plant. So phytonutrients, phytochemicals used interchangeably. I include a lot of herbs and spices, and that's where a lot of these colors are coming from. So if you haven't checked out Color Me Vegan, you can still get copies wherever books are sold. Well, at least used books. And so we already know about health benefits. You already know about health benefits of a spice like turmeric. But let's talk about some others. Let's talk about turmeric for a minute. So turmeric is known for its antioxidant effects, but also its anti-inflammatory effects. And with any kind of nutrient, any kind of plant-based nutrient, you want to just be mindful that it's not enough to just take it in, you want to keep it in. Meaning you want to increase your body's ability to absorb the nutrient, and that's called bioavailability. So when it comes to something like turmeric is especially bioavailable when, it seems, based on studies, when it's consumed with fats. So you can eat it with nuts or seeds or what have you, whole fats, or if you cook it in oil. So it's one of the reasons there are a lot of studies on Indian cuisine with turmeric, because turmeric is one of the main ingredients in curry powder, and turmeric is also used just directly in Indian cuisine, and it tends to be made with oil. And so that does increase the bioavailability of it. Something else that increases the bioavailability of turmeric is eating it with black pepper. So for instance, I will make a milk with turmeric, and I do this several times a week. So I just basically have some plant-based milk, and I love heating it up first. It's a really lovely way to drink it. I put in about a half a teaspoon of turmeric, and then I use my pepper mill, and I then add some nutmeg on the top, and I just kind of stir that up, and it's absolutely delicious. I know it doesn't sound appealing, but I think it's absolutely delicious. It's almost a treat. It's a treat because of the nutmeg. It's really warming. The pepper is a little spicy, and the turmeric is really warming as well. One thing to say is the studies are really showing that the effects that we find in turmeric, these really beneficial effects, the antioxidant effects, the anti-inflammatory properties, etc., They're really seen in turmeric itself, not turmeric capsules. So, and also not curcumin, which is the phytochemical that makes turmeric as healthy as it is. So what you really want to do is ground turmeric is absolutely fine. You can also use fresh turmeric, the turmeric root, and just grate it. But the fresh turmeric is fine. The ground turmeric is fine as well. Just make sure it's not, it's not stale, and you want to keep it stored very well. So we know about the effects of turmeric, and it's become a bit of a star kind of in the public imagination. Ginger, we've already known for years. It has anti-nausea effects. It has anti-inflammatory properties. It can alleviate muscle pain and soreness. And, whenever I have a sore throat, one of the first things I do is make ginger infusions. So I will put fresh ginger in a little tea ball and a little bit of agave nectar and a little bit of lemon juice, and that is my ginger infusion, my tisane, as you will, and I love it. Garlic, of course, we've known for decades the antimicrobial properties that boost the immune system. Allicin, which is the compound in garlic, also in onions, for instance, and shallots. It's a compound that has potential cardiovascular benefits, reduces blood pressure, potentially has anti-inflammatory effects as well, garlic. Cinnamon can also have anti-inflammatory effects, can also regulate blood sugar levels, and mint, as we've known also, whenever I get a little tummy ache, I will make some mint infusion, and it really helps with digestion and can, again, with its anti-inflammatory properties, it can ease any kind of inflammation and can also help with headache. So those are just some examples, but I mean, the lists go on and on and on and on. But this is not about getting any of these through pills. Obviously, it's about consuming them through your diet. So just making sure you're incorporating all of these herbs and spices. All of them have healthful properties. Okay, you say, I'm convinced, but aside from just adding fresh herbs to salads and to soups at the end, how can I cook with herbs and spices? And at what point during cooking should I add them? So, spices, ground or whole seeds, for instance, like cumin seeds, they can be added at any point in the cooking time, preferably in the beginning, so that they have plenty of time to cook into the dish and flavor that dish. When it comes to fresh herbs, a little bit of a difference between the hard herbs, like think about your hard woody stems like rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, right? They benefit the dish most when they're added toward the beginning of cooking as well. So there's time to extract all those oils to flavor the dish completely. The softer herbs like parsley and basil and marjoram and dill, they should be added closer to the end, almost as garnish, to enjoy their flavor as much as possible, because you're going to lose a lot of that flavor if they just get wet and wilted. They're just not going to have as much flavor. So consider those soft herbs as herbs to add toward the end, and the harder herbs to add toward the beginning. And then sometimes you're going to be removing those hard herbs as well because you don't want to eat the stems, for instance. So you can even get like a little herb infusion bag. They have this little, just little bags you can get, and you can just drop them into a soup, and then you just pull them out when the soup is done. You've gotten all the flavor out of the fresh herbs and the stems without having all of the woody stems in the finished dish itself. Dried herbs are best to be used in recipes where, again, there's plenty of time for them to be cooked in. So you can obviously use dried herbs the same way you would use dried spices. But as far as the fresh herbs, use those at the very end. Okay, now you're convinced to do that. So, how to pair herbs and spices with different foods, how to know what goes with what. So, my first suggestion is to experiment, to get to know herbs and spices, to get to know their flavor, their potency, their brightness, their depth, whatever it is they're going to contribute to a dish. Get to know them. That you'll be able to say something like, I really feel like something savory, something that has a bit more of a grassy flavor, something that has a bit more of a pungent flavor, something that has a bit more of a bitter flavor. And you'll be able to pull out those spices and herbs based on exactly what you want. And then you'll be able to identify the dishes in different cuisines and different cultures and different countries based on those flavor profiles as well. So get to know them. Get to know those spices, use them. Even if you make a mistake or you learn, oh God, I really don't want to put too much cumin in, it's just too much, or I don't want to put too much turmeric in, it's going to make it too bitter, right? That's how you'll learn. That's how you learn. Now, if you do purchase the Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Herbs and Spices on demand class, you will get a pairing guide for herbs and spices. It would be really boring for me to just sit here and list them now on the podcast, but trust me, if you go to joyfulvegan.com, click on recipes and classes, and then click on, do a search. You can do a search, or you can just go browse around and find you can just type in herbs and spices in the search bar, and you can find these packets. So you're really going to get a lot out of it. You don't just get recipes. You're getting pairing guides, you're getting cuisines that are related to the different herbs and spices, and so much more. And then of course you're going to get the recipes. Now, for the pairing guide, I have in one column, for instance, the name of the plant food, and then in the other column, the spices and herbs that tend to go well with them. So asparagus will be on the left column, and on the right column will be all of the herbs and spices that go well with asparagus. White beans on the left, and then all the herbs and spices. And I say white beans because then there's red beans, then there's black beans, because they're different. White beans are not going to have the same flavor profile and thus not have the same pairing with the herbs and spices as, say, black beans, eggplants, tomatoes, carrots, whatever. So you're going to get that in the pairing guide. Also, I mentioned there is the cooking with herbs and spices from around the world. So in that packet, you get, I kind of break it up by Chinese cuisine and Mediterranean cuisine. And so you get different recipes based on those, because I'm kind of focusing on global herbs and spices. Okay, just a little plug there for these recipe packets and these on-demand classes, because they're really packed with lots of information. Okay, we're talking about cooking. Let's talk a little bit about infusions. So people who want to make infused water or tisanes, I know we would call them herbal teas, where you can use lemon balm or chamomile or peppermint or hibiscus, rose hips, lavender, cinnamon. So you can make your own infusions. I am a stickler about not saying tea if there's not the Camellia sinensis involved in it. So if it's not tea, it's not a tea. If it's not white tea or black tea or green tea, it's not tea. So I tend to say hibiscus infusion or a tisane, but for all intents and purposes, people, drink mint tea, even if there's no tea. I make mint tisane. I make a mint tisane. I make a mint infusion almost every night. David does as well. And my favorite is just going to my bulk store, getting a bunch of dried mint, and then that just gets steeped into hot water. You can do that with any dried herb. You can do that with anything. And it's just so fresh and so delicious. It's going to be better than any tea bag you ever buy. Please trust me. And I know you're thinking, well, I can't get bulk, I don't know, mint or what have you. You don't know. You might be able to, and you might even be able to order these online somewhere. But the point is, you getting the dried, I was going to say the fresh herbs, the dried herbs fresh is going to be better than anything sitting in a tea bag. And you can also dry herbs yourself. So, I mean, I used to, oh my gosh, when I was in my 20s, I had a huge kind of Victorian decor phase. And I had those herb dryers in my apartment. And it was adorable, right? Because it was just this like really pretty, and like you see them in, kind of old, little houses and, in kind of old country kitchens, you'd have the board, and then I would just hang whatever it was, the rosemary, the lavender, the mint, and that's just a really good way. And I still do it. Just, I don't have the little hangers anymore, but it's very easy to just hang up any fresh bunch of herbs, dry them a couple days, and then you can just crumble them into a jar, and there you go. And so I'll do that with mint as well. Yes, you can steep fresh herbs, but they're not going to be as pungent. The dried herbs are going to have just a much more powerful flavor than the fresh herbs will. So just consider that. So That's super easy to just make a tisane or make an infusion. You can do it with cold water as well, and I will do that. Maybe takes a little longer for the flavor to infuse into the water, but hibiscus, again, I'll go to my bulk store here in Oakland. I get hibiscus flowers and I steep that in water. One of my favorite things, especially in the summertime, a little bit of agave, a little bit of lemon juice. It is so packed with antioxidants. It's so gorgeous. It's so colorful. It's so delicious. It's so refreshing. And I do that pretty often. So see what you can do about getting some dried and fresh herbs and infusing them to make infused water. What about infusing oil with herbs and vinegar? You can do the same thing. I mean, you can go find steps online to do that, but absolutely you can do that. You'd start with your oil or you'd start with your vinegar, and then you'd prepare your herbs. You want your herbs to be washed, obviously, but you want them to be thoroughly dry. And you can absolutely use fresh herbs for this, and I would use fresh herbs for this. You want to bruise them a little bit, where you just kind of punch them a little bit and kind of, again, open them up a little bit to just release all of their oils. And then you would just pop them in the oil or pop them in the vinegar. Now, some people also heat the oil or heat the vinegar. It does help a little bit. It's not necessary, but it does help a little bit to release those essential oils from the herbs. So I would heat the oil first a little bit. You don't want to boil it, but just heat it a little bit. Heat up the vinegar a little bit. You can use balsamic vinegar. You can use apple cider vinegar. You can use white vinegar, red vinegar, whatever you want. And then just heat up the vinegar a little bit and then put those fresh herbs in there. Seal the jar, put it in a dark place for at least 2 weeks. The longer the infusion, the more robust the flavor is going to be. And then after the infusion period, when you feel like you've got the flavor in the oil or the vinegar, you just strain out the herbs. You can use a sieve again, or a cheesecloth, or just if they're just whole, stems, you can just pull them out. And then you transfer that infused vinegar or oil to a clean bottle and store it in a dark place. And you've got infused herbs, herbal oil. And they're great gifts, but if you do give them as gifts, I've been given them as gifts. You want to tell your recipient that they need to pull, because it's really pretty when you give them a gift of infused oil that you infused yourself, maybe with herbs from your garden or something like that. And you don't want to keep those herbs in there forever. They're just gonna, again, like the water I mentioned earlier, can wind up being oversteeped. And also, they're just going to kind of the oils can just get too strong. And so you want to tell them to, after a couple weeks, taste the oil, taste the vinegar, and they can decide themselves. But eventually they're going to want to pull out the herbs. Same thing with edible flowers. Of course, you can use edible flowers in your cooking or in your preparation. They are so gorgeous and so beautiful and also have all those phytochemicals. So there's going to be lots of nutrient benefits as well to adding edible flowers. I mean, there's nothing prettier than a green salad with nasturtiums or lavender or pansies or whatever it is. So let's talk about a couple of those. So nasturtiums, we used to have in our old house, we used to have nasturtiums. And if you have nasturtiums, you know that they just spread from here to kingdom come. They're just amazing and prolific, which is great. And they're peppery and they're fantastic. So plant some nasturtiums, orange, yellow nasturtiums, and add those petals to salads, to sandwiches, to garnish savory dishes, whatever. So fantastic, nasturtiums. Also marigolds, they have a slightly bitter to tangy flavor. Also calendula, it's called calendula or marigolds. Add those petals also to salads, to rice. After your rice is cooked and cooled, toss your rice with some of the beautiful marigold petals. I mean, you can do that with any of the petals I'm talking about, any of the edibles. The edibles, not the edibles, different kind of edibles, the edible flowers. You can do that with any of these. Lavender, wonderful to infuse in syrups. So you can get some agave or vinegar again and infuse it with some lavender. Beautiful. And then obviously you can also make baked goods, cookies, lavender, so wonderful. Rose, same thing. Rose is sweet and floral, but it can be overdone. You don't want your finished product to taste like soap or perfume. So just use them sparingly, but the petals are gorgeous and they can be used again in salads, jams, desserts, etc. Pansies and violets, I kind of think of them interchangeably. Pansies have a bit of a grassy flavor, and violets have a bit more of a floral flavor. Both can be added to salads, desserts. You can freeze them in ice cubes, which make them gorgeous to add to beverages, right? I know. I know. It's such a brilliant idea. And so dandelion, we've talked about dandelion greens, but dandelion, the petals again, and the young leaves are wonderful for salads, and you can also infuse them. Hibiscus, we mentioned, tart, gorgeous, antioxidants. Steep them in water, but you can also use them in salads and desserts. Okay. So what about substitutions? Because people ask a lot about substitutions. It is helpful to know this. So, for the most part, I mentioned that the dried herb is going to be a lot stronger than the fresh herb. So, consider that when you are thinking of doing a switcheroo, if a recipe calls for a tablespoon of chopped basil and you only have dried basil, it really depends on the dish. You're not going to want to make pesto with dried basil, for instance, but I'm using basil as an example. You're going to want to use a teaspoon. So it's about a tablespoon of fresh chopped herbs to a teaspoon of dried herbs. Now I'm talking about herbs here, not spices yet. So that's just kind of a ratio to think about. And of course, there's 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon. So it's really a third of what would be called for when you're switching from fresh herbs to dried herbs or vice versa. But again, depends on the recipe because some things you don't want to use dried herbs for. You just want the fresh herbs. Now, when it comes to something like ginger is very different. So if a recipe, like a baking recipe, calls for ginger powder, I mean, you can use fresh ginger as well. You want to just obviously, kind of grate it. You can use a fresh ginger in any baked good if you're making ginger muffins, or it's wonderful to have some grated fresh ginger. However, if a recipe calls for fresh ginger, it's not going to be the same if you just add ground ginger. So ground ginger is very much used for baking, kind of along with things like cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, right? So think of it as one of those warming spices for certainly winter and fall desserts. But fresh ginger root is different. So you're not always going to be able to do a switcheroo between fresh ginger and ground ginger powder. So just keep that in mind. And speaking of substitutions, what about not just between dried and fresh? I keep wanting to say fried. Dried and fresh because dried and fried. Yeah. So not just between dried and fresh, but what about substituting spices just themselves? So what if a recipe calls for nutmeg and you don't have nutmeg? What can you use instead? What if a recipe calls for cinnamon and you don't have cinnamon? What can you use instead? Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these. Again, you get this entire PDF when you order the Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Herbs and Spices on demand class at joyfulvegan.com. So I'm not going to go over every single one here because there's a lot to say, but just keep in mind, kind of group them together. I grouped together, for instance, those warming spices, your nutmeg, your allspice, allspice is usually a blend of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. So there's your allspice. So if you don't have allspice, but you have cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, there you go. You can just use that. Nutmeg, same kind of thing. So you can replace, if a recipe calls for nutmeg, it's probably because it wants some kind of that sweet, nutty, warming flavor. So you can use allspice, you can use cinnamon, you can use mace is another one. You can use cloves. Now, cloves are very strong, so be very careful with cloves. You don't want even to add, I would say if it calls for a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, I would use 1/8 of a teaspoon of cloves. So just consider that. And you can always add it to your baked good or to your batter. Taste it, see if it needs more, and then add a little bit more. So cinnamon, mace, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, all of these, kind of combine to be part of that same category of spices, and they can pretty much be used interchangeably. I mentioned anise seed and fennel seeds earlier. They can be used interchangeably if you have one and not the other, and a recipe calls for one or the other. Same thing with your green herbs, your basil, thyme, oregano, savory, marjoram. They can be swapped out as well. You can never go wrong, adding, parsley instead of oregano. Whether it's dried or fresh, you're going to be fine either way. Cumin has a very distinct flavor. It's also a warm flavor, very earthy. But if you find that you don't have it, you can substitute it with something like coriander ground coriander, and you can also substitute it with a combination of ground coriander and fennel seeds. So you can kind of grind those up together, and you can get a profile that's similar to the flavor profile of cumin. Fresh cilantro, fresh parsley, tarragon, they can be interchangeable very easily. Garlic powder and fresh garlic. I would say, I mean, it's hard. I never measure fresh garlic, but 1 clove of garlic, think of it as the equivalent to about an eighth of a teaspoon of garlic powder. It's very different. They're very different. I always say use fresh garlic when you can. There's a couple recipes I use dried garlic for, garlic powder, but when you can, just use fresh garlic. And we talked about ginger. Paprika, you know, it, it's not gonna be spicy like a cayenne or a chili powder, but you can kind of think about paprika and the chilies and the cayennes kind of interchangeable. You're just gonna be mindful of the fact that it's, spicy if you're using chili powder instead of paprika. But I also will use smoked paprika very often, and I always use chipotle chili powder. So I tend to use when I'm using a recipe that calls for smoked paprika or paprika, I'll always use smoked paprika, but the chipotle chili powder goes really well with it. And that goes for any of the chilies. And of course, you can swap out any of the chili powders or even a red pepper. If it's calling for crushed red peppers, you can use a kind of chili powder. If you don't have red pepper flakes or chili powder, you can use a hot pepper sauce, right? Or black pepper, the peppercorn, using a pepper mill. Saffron, if a recipe calls for saffron, if it's just for color, you can use a dash of turmeric, but for flavor, nothing compares. There is no substitute for saffron. But if it is for color, because turmeric and saffron wind up having the same color in the end, because saffron, even though the threads are red, the infused liquid will be yellow. And whatever you make with, or your dough or whatever, it's going to be more of a gorgeous, gorgeous golden yellow color. And same with turmeric. But if you use too much turmeric, it's going to taste bitter. And if it calls for saffron, just get some saffron. So I hope that helps. As far as the herbs, how to freeze them. So absolutely, absolutely freeze your fresh herbs, especially if you have more than you know what to do with and you've infused all your water and you still have fresh herbs, or if you have a garden, or if you have a ton of rosemary like we do, or if you have an herb garden and you just get a ton, a huge bumper crop every year, then absolutely freeze herbs. So very easy. Chop up your herbs first. Then you put them in a ice cube tray. If you still have ice cube, I mean, I only have ice cube trays, I swear, for this purpose, because we have a refrigerator that, a freezer that has an automatic freeze ice cube maker, which we love, and I'm happy I have that. And I definitely love having the ice cube trays for freezing herbs. Now, I mentioned before those hard herbs, those are the ones that are on that thicker stem, like your rosemary or thyme. So no matter what, you're going to want to pull the rosemary, the thyme, the sage off of the stem, and then you're going to chop the herbs. For the soft herbs, you can just chop the stems as well because they tend to be softer, but you can also remove them. And so you pack those chopped herbs in your ice cube trays, and I would absolutely make sure you are labeling them if you want to keep track of what you're freezing. And then you cover them with water. Some people use oil. I don't think it's necessary. I cover the ice cube trays with water that are packed with the fresh chopped herbs, and then I pop those ice cube trays in the freezer. Once they're frozen, then I take the cubes out and I transfer them to an airtight container so that it's super easy to just get like your single serve cubes of herbs. And then you can pop them into a stew, you can pop them into a soup or stir fry, whatever you like. You don't have to even thaw them because obviously once you put them in the hot soup, they're going to thaw themselves. Now, how long do those frozen ice cubes with the fresh herbs last? Listen, the point is to freeze anything for use, not posterity. So the idea is to eat the food that's in your freezer. So often people use their freezers as storage bins, and then a year later they're like, oh yeah, I forgot about all of this food, and then they toss it because it has freezer burn or it doesn't have flavor anymore. So absolutely, you put on your calendar a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, whatever you have in your freezer, so that you're reminded to go and eat whatever you put in there. So how long will they last? I mean, 6 months, everything's kind of good for 6 months, but honestly, you should be using them more frequently than that. And whenever you put anything new that is, in your, if you're adding anything to your refrigerator or freezer so that you don't forget about the things and so that your refrigerator doesn't compost your fresh produce, take the things out that are already in your refrigerator, like, apples, maybe you have some cauliflower left over, some broccolini, whatever. Pull all of that out, put your new stuff in. That's going to get pushed to the back, and then put your old stuff in the front, because otherwise you're just going to keep pushing everything to the back and never eat it. Okay. So I think that's everything. I really have probably more to say, but I feel like I've run my course here, and I feel like you probably don't want to hear anymore. But I hope you check out the on-demand classes over at joyfulvegan.com. The turmeric milk I mentioned is over also in the packet, the hibiscus infused water. Za'atar we make a poultry, quote unquote, poultry seasoning. We make an herb infused simple syrup that you can use for cocktails or mocktails. There's also in the cooking with global herbs and spices, there's the scalloped potatoes, herb scalloped potatoes, which is Mediterranean. I mentioned the Chinese. I have a 5-spice onion soup, which is very Chinese inspired. And then I have an aloo gobi, which is Indian inspired. So go check out joyfulvegan.com, and don't forget to become a member of Food for Thought through Apple Podcasts, become a patron through Patreon. Everything is over at joyfulvegan.com. I hope you check out the trips we have over at the Vegan Trips menu item, and maybe we can meet in person and enjoy some adventures together. I hope you have a wonderful day. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.